Good morning, everybody. Oh, I'm having microphone trouble today. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad to see you here. This is one of those Sundays when the South Parish Hall is occupied by something else. This time it's occupied by set up for a reception after the 11 o'clock service. So if you're here because you're forced to be here, don't worry. You do. Microphone is just driving me crazy. You do not have to participate. You can just sit there and glaze over and just trust that everybody else will carry the class. Before we start, can I get a volunteer who will walk around the room with a microphone? Who would do that for me? John, would you do that for me? Thank you. I appreciate that. If you didn't get a handout, I passed them out earlier, but many of y'all have come in since I did that. They're on the table right by the door. Everything on the handout will be on the screen. We're talking about wilderness, and it's our second week, but before we look any further, let's pray this prayer. It's on the screen. Let me see if I can make it even bigger on the screen. Hold on now. Make it bigger. There we go. So it's also at the top of your handout. And as I acknowledged last week, this prayer doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily as some of the others we offer. But let's pray this prayer as we seek wilderness, and then we'll talk more about wilderness together. But let's pray this prayer together. Lord of the fast, we come before you as sinners, but fully aware of your divine mercy. Still, we need this fast. For only in stepping away from the things of this world are we able to fathom the immeasurable gift that is our redemption. Turn our noses from the scents around us that we may again know the sweet fragrance of Christ. Numb our tongues from all that allures them so that we may taste anew the bread of our salvation. Dull our touch to all sensations so that we may feel only the pulse of our hearts, longing to reconcile with our brothers and sisters and you, our Maker. Stop our ears from all that allure them so that we may hear your strong song of mercy calling us back to the embrace of our Father. Blind our eyes from all that distracts them so that we may gaze fully on the light of Christ. And once we have met you there in the wilderness, then return us to the world. Send us back among your people that we may fill their senses with all we have found in you, all that is good, all that is loving, all that is merciful. Amen. So last week we looked at the story of Hagar, and as she runs away from Sarai, her mistress, and Abram, her husband, who has pretty much given up on her as wife in order to satisfy the demands of his other wife, Sarai. And we looked at how she flees into the wilderness, and there God meets her in the wilderness, and God does something really unusual. God makes a covenant with Hagar, the only woman in the Bible with whom God makes a covenant. Hagar gives God a name, El Roi, the only person in the Bible, to name God. Something fascinating happens there, and we talked a little bit about wilderness, but what I want to get to again today is why wilderness matters. Why would we ever go to the wilderness? Why, when it's dangerous, hard to live in, everything's more difficult, nothing is for granted, everything's harder, why would we ever choose to go in the wilderness? And that's some of the question that I want us to ask today. I want to start with another short video. And this is a video from Canadian Geographic, and I'm only going to play a few minutes of the video, but I want you to listen particularly to the way they describe wilderness, not only physical wilderness, but spiritual wilderness in this video. Let's listen to this.
Wilderness, I guess, is a bit of a tricky thing to define. To me, I suppose it's more of an experience rather than a place with defined boundaries. It's an experience where you feel that you're fitting into your role in the way the natural system is going, and you feel quite a bit of freedom. sometimes it's a whole day of feeling that, wow, I'm very isolated where I'm working right now. Or sometimes it's just a few moments somewhere and you catch a glimpse around and realize that you're in an amazing place. And to me, that makes me feel that I'm in the wilderness.
We have what we call zoning that we set out for national parks, and it's a way that we manage our park system. And what the zoning does is define which areas we consider wildland zones or wilderness areas compared to those areas like in the Bow Valley, which are high use area. And it's a way of managing a park. I don't think we could look at it as a defined line that, you know, you step across and say that's wilderness and that's not. And it just, as you get further and further away from town site, further away from human occupation, it becomes more and more of what we consider a wilderness area.
Wilderness isn't a place you can draw on a map. I think it's an attitude. It's an approach to how you think. And certainly when we're back in a place like this, and we're on a 8-day trip where, you know, we've seen just a handful of people, that I think we immediately say, oh yeah, this is wilderness. And it is, and it's the sort of in-your-face wilderness. But wilderness also is, you know, for a kid, the dragonflies preying on mosquitoes in their backyard, you know, in the middle of an urban neighborhood. It's the weeds growing up through the cracks in a sidewalk, and slowly, you know, like the things that kind of belong in that place that would happen without, you know, if we just sort of left things to their own. That's what wilderness and wildness is.
There was one night, we were working trail crew, we were in the backcountry in the Bryant Valley, and it was a beautiful, beautiful week. We were getting lots of our work done.
Going down through Peters Creek on the north end of the park, and it's raining cats and dogs. You've got your slicker on, you're soggy, you're wet, you're cold, you're tired.
And it was one of those perfect evenings with the sun going down, soft light on the mountains.
And you just, for a moment, say, well, I'm going to sit down and have a smoke and a bite to eat.
And just as it was getting dark, we could hear two bull elk bugling at each other from across the valley.
You smell that fresh rain. You hear the rain rattling off your hat and the stream going by.
And eventually them meeting up and their antlers clashing together over the valley as the sun set.
Kind of like, this is kind of nice. You know, it doesn't matter that it's cold. It doesn't matter that you're uncomfortable.
After a hard day's work, those kind of moments definitely stick out in particular to me.
Well, it's like, this is home. Like, this feels good. I should be here. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I think a huge value of these places is it's almost sort of a spiritual or mental value or balance point for the rest of humanity, for all of humanity. Even if you'll never get to these places, just knowing that they exist is hugely important for human mental health. When you're feeling stressed or completely overwhelmed in the middle of a city, you know, and you've had a harrowing day at work, and you come home and maybe the kids are screaming, the car broke down, the furnace is acting up, and you're just about, you know, you're ready to shoot yourself. And then you remember, wow, but there are these areas. Like this is just a small part of the world. The world is actually a big, beautiful place. Like, get a grip of yourself. This isn't what life is. Life is the beautiful celebration of big, wild places. And just knowing that that exists, that grizzly bears are roaming, you know, these alpine meadows, the deer and wolves are moving through these valleys, the birds are nesting in these willows, thickets, and just that life has so much power and persistence, all have a calming effect that allow you to remember who you are, what you are, and how you fit in.
I hope you enjoy that as much as I do. Let me ask some questions, whether you want to reflect on the video or just the questions in general. They're the questions about what sort of wilderness, and I'm going to ask the first two together. What are the characteristics of physical wilderness, and what are characteristics of spiritual wilderness? And John's got a microphone, and John will come to you, so if you'll raise your hand and share it with us. But when you think of physical wilderness, spiritual wilderness, what are the characteristics of those? And then, of course, how are they related? Yeah.
I think both require effort to exist in.
Thank you. What else? What else? Yeah.
My thoughts are that a physical wilderness a true wilderness is where you really need to rely upon God to care for you and you can see his hand. But a spiritual wilderness, to me, is when God is absent, and that's a really scary thing.
Thank you. What else? What else are some of the characteristics of physical wilderness or spiritual wilderness? Yeah, Alan.
I see the physical wilderness as, our physical world broken down to its most basic material. And I think the spiritual wilderness would be the same, where your spiritual beliefs and everything are broken down into the most basic ideas.
Yeah, thank you. What else? Other characteristics or the connection between the two? Yeah, and then back to Alan. Thank you.
I think physical and spiritual, you're using your senses to experience it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And then Alan?
So I'm just thinking about like camping and stuff like that. Even though you're enjoying the amazing things he's talking about, you're really, really uncertain. There's nothing you can predict. You can't predict the weather, the animals, your food, your health. So even though you feel a connection, you're not relaxed.
Yeah.
Or there's two things going on at the same time.
Yeah.
Whereas outside the wilderness, sort of towns or homes or whatever, there's a degree of predictability.
Thank you. Yep, Star.
I guess most Americans would physically define wilderness as being a forested area, but my concept of wilderness is basically shaped by the Bible, and in the Bible they're talking about a desert with nothing in it. As far as the spiritual definition, I guess one is on the spiritual plane and one is on the physical plane, but I would see the spiritual wilderness as a place where you are alone with God, whether it's in a forest or in a desert.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, Kristen.
I just think of them as both of them as both can be very dark, in a very, very dark place, and perhaps looking for light in both of them as well.
It's interesting, last week when we talked just about wilderness, we didn't talk about the spiritual aspect, and maybe it's just me, but everything I heard was positive. We love it. It's peaceful. It's beautiful. It's a great place to be. I want to go there. I want to be there. And now when we start talking about spiritual wilderness, we're like, I don't know about that. Like, that's dark. That's scary. That's alone. That's threatening. That's without God. Like, I just find that interesting. I want to kind of fold back in on it because actually I don't know that they're all that different. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, so I have a completely different view of that. I don't differentiate between the two. And for me, it's where I find the most peace. When I go out there, a lot of times I don't want to come back because I feel most at home there.
Yeah, thank you. So in Hebrew, the language of most of the Old Testament, the word that is wilderness, it also does get translated desert. Sometimes it's desert, more often wilderness. But the root of the word, it's mabar is the word, but the root of the word means driven, as in the place that you would drive cattle. Like or sometimes God's people might be driven there as well. But in a sense, and this is also true in the New Testament in the Greek language, it's as much about what it isn't as what it is, right? The wilderness is what it is it's where people aren't, right? So it doesn't work to graze cattle in people's backyards. You kind of have to get out of the way, right? So you push them out, right? So think about when Moses met his father-in-law Jethro. He was keeping sheep out in the wilderness. He wasn't going on a spiritual pilgrimage. He was leading his flock, Jethro's flocks, away from the people, right? Because nobody wants to be surrounded by cattle for too long, right? Or livestock for too long. And it's out in the wilderness places where the livestock were driven that God met Moses in the burning bush. And so I want to hold on to all of the positives that we have, but also I want to note that part of what makes wilderness possible, whether it's physical or spiritual, is the sense that we have been driven, pushed, stretched, or at least sometimes we choose, of course, to go to that place, but we're going to that place where people aren't. And in the story of Hagar, I think part of the reason that God is able to show up with Hagar in the wilderness is that she has stepped away from the authority, the control, the power of, in this case, Abram and Sarai, right? And even though they're on their own pilgrimage of sorts, it is by stepping away from the predetermined, predefined structures of society. This is how much the gallon of milk costs, and this is how much the gallon of gas costs, and you will drive on the right side of the road, and you will give way at a four-way stop, etc. So to step into the wilderness is to step outside of all of those givens, those norms that define human life, and to step into a place where human structures don't define it. And so as a result, it's dangerous. It can be disorienting, maybe more than anything. It can be utterly lonely. Whether we find God in that wilderness or not is a great question. I want to ask in this series, what sort of God do we find in the wilderness? Or maybe a better way to put that is, how does wilderness help us see something, learn something, know something about God that we city slickers can't otherwise hear and hold on to? But I want to acknowledge that in most of the biblical examples, when wilderness plays a role, people don't wake up and think, you know what I need? I need a pilgrimage. I need a spiritual retreat. So I'm going to pack my supplies and make sure I've got everything I need, and I'm going to go spend a week in the wilderness. That is not the way it goes. It is get up and go now. And sometimes they're, as we'll see today, running for their lives. And God shows up in that kind of wilderness, and some of us have experienced that wilderness, and some of us have heard about it, but maybe haven't experienced it. Let's read some of the story of Elijah, and then we'll come back to this subject of wilderness. And I've split it up in half. I think the center of the story will be really familiar to us, but I suspect that the sides of the story, the outlying part of the story, might not be as familiar to us. Let me give you a little bit of a preface, which is to say, 1 Kings 18 is my favorite chapter in the Bible. It's been my favorite chapter since I was about 10, because it's this wonderful, dramatic story about Elijah versus the prophets of Baal or Baal. And they try to call on their God to show up, and their God doesn't show up, of course. And Elijah's God does show up, and then Elijah not only shows them up, but he chases them down and kills them all with a sword. And for a 10-year-old, that was just good Sunday school material. So that's chapter 18. Chapter 19 is what comes next, and we're going to split it up in half. Who would read for us the first part, 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 10? Who would read that for us? Thank you. Adam and Brandy, would you read the second part? Great.
So this is directly following the...
Yeah, the prophets of Baal. Yeah.
Nice. That part rules. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. And he asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake of bread, was a cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away."
Thank you. Let's stop there. All right, what do you notice? What do you notice in the story? What's interesting in the story? What's provocative in the story? What's challenging in the story? Or you can look at the questions that I've written, which is why does God show up with food, and why does God ask Elijah why he's doing there? But what do you notice? What draws you into this story, other than the running for his life bit, which I find fascinating? What interests you in this story? Yeah.
I think the provision of food is kind of God's showing him that he recognizes his humanity and he cares about him in that realm.
Yeah, thank you. And it's not the first time God showed up and given Elijah some bread. Earlier, it was the widow at Zarephath, right? The one that that Elijah shows up in previous to this and shows up and says, "Hey, make me some bread." And she says, "I only have enough for my son and me. We're going to eat it. We're going to die." He goes, "Don't worry, God will take care of it." And he eats with her. But yeah, so bread matters to Elijah. Yeah. What else? What else interests you? Where do you feel energy in the story?
I'm curious why he says that he's no better than his ancestors. This just seems like a weird or out of context comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Up front with Brandy.
I think I found it interesting that God sent him food, and the angel said, "Wake up and eat." And they said, "Wake up and eat, or you won't survive." And he's preparing him for this time in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like we're getting an idea of what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
He's going into the wilderness for a really long time.
Yeah. Yes. I also think it shifts. Elijah is trying to escape. He's trying to escape notice. He's trying to not be found. Like, he doesn't want to be found. He wants to hide. He's ready to die. His life is empty or over, and God's like, I've got something for you. I've got something positive for you. I'm not finished with you yet. There's a journey ahead of you. Yeah, get ready. Yeah, Adam.
It's almost as though God is like, okay, you don't really want to die. Have some cake,
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, it's cool that God provides him food because you can't, if you're hiding in the wilderness, you can't make a fire and make food for yourself, right? And there's hot food, miraculously. So that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, wilderness is kind of the place where that's right, there's no grocery store. Sometimes we'll go on a vacation or a trip, and we'll try to figure out everything that we have to pack, and then suddenly we're like, we're going to a place that has grocery stores. Why are we so worried about that, right? But the wilderness is not that place, right? If you don't take it with you, you don't get it. Yeah.
Yeah, that part stood out to me too, because I don't think, like Adam said, I don't think he wants to die. He's just terrified, and God meets him in that moment with a lot of compassion. And instead of being like, "Look at the life that I gave you," he's like, "Look, I get it. This is not what you signed up for. Let me give you some relief from this and some renewal." So at the lowest point, that renewal is available.
Yeah, thank you. James up front.
So I think there's some interesting context to this, is that Elijah is being forced to flee to the wilderness because the Israelites have turned away from God and they have killed all the other prophets. So Elijah feels like he doesn't have any choice. His life is already forfeit. He is running from his people, and he's running into the wilderness and saying, "Okay, God, if all the other prophets are dead, I'm next. What do you want me to do? Just take my life now because I can't go back there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's really nowhere else for him to go. Right? He's not sure who will keep company with him, who will protect him. Yeah, Ahab's the king, right? And Elijah's been sticking it to Ahab for a while. I mean, just calling him out for his faithlessness and his failures. There's been a tremendous drought. The rain has just come, but there's been tremendous drought in the land. And when the prices at the grocery store get so high that we can't afford the things that we're used to, we start to blame our leaders, right? The same is true in the ancient world, right? When people can't get enough water to feed their cattle or to have crops to eat bread, people are dying of starvation. They begin to blame their leader, Ahab, and Elijah's the one who's saying, you see what your king is up to? So there's been this wonderful conflict between them. It's a great relationship. And here it seems to come to a head. What I find curious is that Elijah has over and over and over again demonstrated through God such amazing, triumphant expressions of power and victory that why is he running now? Just the previous chapter, in this very dramatic fashion, he calls the name of the Lord, and God sends down fire, and it consumes everything, and that he kills all of the enemy prophets, right? He kills them all. That's such an expression of power, and now he's scared for his life. What happened? Maybe he hadn't had enough food to eat. Maybe he was just hungry. I don't know, but it's a strange bit. And I hear when God shows up and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I hear it sort of a real challenge to Elijah's understanding of who he is and how he belongs to God, and being in the wilderness where he might as well just die, right? I don't know if this is true, but it seems in Elijah's case, and I suspect it might be in our cases as well, that it's easier to give up and die in a wilderness, whether it's a spiritual wilderness or a physical wilderness. And I don't think he went there expecting to escape from God, but he's kind of, despite all the successes he has had, despite all the sign that God is with him, he's pretty much ready to pack it up. And God asked that question. So what are you doing here, Elijah? As if God doesn't know. Let's read the second bit, which might provoke some even more profound theological reflection. Brandy up front is going to read it for us. Thank you. And let me make sure I can zoom to where we can see all of it. This is not the end of the chapter, but it's the end of the part that we will read. Thank you, Brandy.
He said, "Go out and stand on the mountains before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elijah, son of Shaphat, of Abel Mahaloah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elijah shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him."
Thank you. I didn't tell you were going to have those names, but you did
I
well.
know. I was like, oh
Thank you. No,
my goodness.
I appreciate it. So let me ask, so what's the significance of the Lord passing by? Like when God says, go stand on the edge of the mountain because I'm about to pass by, what's the significance? Like what do you think Elijah heard in that? And I'm not looking for an answer, but in your imagination, if God appeared to you in a dream and said, I'm about to pass by your house, go stand on your front porch, like what would you understand the significance of that to be? Richard?
Well, it's very similar to the story of Moses on Mount Sinai. God passed by him, and it's, very significant. God is revealing the divine self to the prophet.
Yeah, it's not just about passing by, it's about showing up, right, in that kind of way. Yeah. What else? Anything else you want to make of the passing by? What would you do if God said, go stand on your porch, I'm about to pass by? What would that look like for you? Yeah. And maybe it's not an accident that God doesn't pass by our front porches, it's the wilderness, right? So maybe instead, let's imagine you're in the wilderness and you're in a tent, and God says, come to the edge of your tent, I'm about to pass by, right? Just, how do you get ready for that in the wilderness, right? Maybe you brought a toothbrush with you, but there's not a lot, right? You're in the wilderness, yeah? So the narrator goes through this almost litany, right? There was a wind, there was an earthquake, there was a fire. God was not in them. Then there's the sound of this voice, this silence, this breeze, this whisper. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Why does the narrator bother to mention all the things that God wasn't in? Like, why does the narrator, why does the voice of the text draw us to the attention that God didn't show up in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire? What's the point? Why tell us where God isn't to be found? Yeah, Trent.
I think of those as all being the drama. When I'm in a wilderness place, and things have fallen apart, first it's like catastrophic thinking, then it's maybe blaming someone, then it's maybe, oh, pitiful me, and then maybe this spiritual eye opens and I'm ready to hear a different way that's kind of outside all my usual responses. And that seems like, okay, I need to listen to this.
Yeah, there's a process of that journey, psychological and also physical in the wilderness. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, to go off of what Trent said, and my thoughts as well, is like, who is this story being told to? Who's going to hear this story, and who, in the context of like, what are the other stories of other gods, and where do they appear? Maybe it's winds and fires and earthquakes and big powerful displays. But if I'm a Hebrew, I can say my God is like in the silent parts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Susie. John's getting a workout today, and I'm grateful. Thank you, John. He didn't raise his hand. You might have noticed I voluntold him to help. I appreciate it.
I think this goes along with what Trent and Adam said, but I think it signifies the waiting. Like the answer doesn't always come immediately. Sometimes there's waiting.
Yeah. Thank you. I wonder, the text doesn't tell us this, but I wonder if part of it is that Elijah recognized that God wasn't in those things where he would have expected it. The text doesn't tell us, but Elijah knew it. We just kind of know it, but somehow Elijah's in that journey, and we're because of the way it's told, we're invited into that waiting as well. Yeah. What else? What else do you make of the not there, not there, not there? Yeah, James.
I feel you can almost draw back into the text of what we just read a little bit, but also, as you mentioned earlier, where Elijah is a prophet and God does all these overt actions. He calls down fire. He does all these things to show the Israelites. And since Elijah is a prophet, he is so used to God being there in action that are bold and definitive, versus God now showing him God is everywhere. He is in the quiet. He's not just in the loud actions. He's also in the places where you contemplate and pray.
Yeah, and I don't think it's an accident that in the previous chapter, God shows up in fire and splits stones. everything gets annihilated that way. And so, I wonder Yeah, I wonder how it's a correction for Elijah, right? That Elijah's ready to give up because maybe he's emptied his bag of tricks. It's not really his tricks, but maybe he's kind of exhausted all of the ways he can figure out how to do this. I also think it's interesting that God doesn't really tell him how it's going to happen. God just sort of says, go do this, go do this, go do this, and trust that he'll take care of that part and he'll take care of that part. Whatever he misses, he'll clean up the mess, right? And God doesn't say, I'm going to defeat Jezebel. God doesn't say, I'm going to keep you safe. God doesn't promise him any of that, and yet the invitation is just to kind of trust that the process will unfold in a good way. Yeah, up front, Randy.
I was thinking about the question you had asked earlier about why now? Why did he give up now? And the first answer that came to my mind was he's human. I mean, he's, like you said, he's done everything. He's exhausted. He's tired. One of the things that sometimes we think about is before we make any big decisions, are you tired? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Because you get emotional. Your emotions aren't on when I get hangry as my husband. So we don't make great decisions then. I think he was just giving up. But a lot of times in my life, God has shown up in the silence. When there's chaos all around, or when you're praying fervently for something, you have a hard time hearing him because your own thoughts are really jumbled up in there. And I think it's just another example how he shows up in the silence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that is a lot of it is like these big things come around and he wasn't there, and he doesn't show up in the big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've experienced reaching a point where I've been driven into the wilderness, by the chaos, by the noise, by the stuff, right? Yeah. Take a look at that next question on the sheet and on the screen. Sometimes people ask me which translation is best, and the answer is the one that you will read, right? So if you will read the King James Version, then you should buy the King James. You should put it by your bedside, because if that's what you will read, then you will read it, right? But some of the tips that I give people, there are a couple of passages that I think are worth reading, and to figure out if you like them. And one of the verses that's worth reading is this verse, because of how wildly differently it can be translated. And I'm not asking you to pick the version that is the most technically correct, but the one that speaks to you this truth. So I've given you a couple of examples. There are more that among the published translations of this phrase still. What was the NRSV? The sound of sheer silence, are a gentle breeze, a sound, thin, quiet, sound of a low whisper, still small voice, sound of a gentle blowing. Sort through all those. Let me ask, so what's the point? What's the Bible, whatever the text says, what's the Bible trying to tell us in a way that we struggle to figure out what the answer is? Yeah.
I've been thinking about this, and I think that he spoke in these gentle ways to allow Elijah to know how intimate his communication was with him. I mean, I was thinking about it. If you go to a concert and everybody gets to enjoy the largeness and the music, and you enjoy that too, or you appreciate it or whatever. But if the performer calls you backstage and speaks to you away from the microphone instead of in the microphone, it's a more intimate, meaningful, personal thing saying, I see you and I'm here.
I love that. Thank you. What else? What else do you think the text is getting at? Yeah, Susan.
Well, I have struggled with this whole concept, and I actually talked to Evan about it because I have never experienced what I would call wilderness physically. I've been to lots of parks and all those things, but I've never, what I would say, be alone. And one of the things that struck me here was at the end of the first paragraph, 13, where it says, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle. and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And then we go into the quiet, the part. And to me, that's the spiritual, internal part that we're taking from this. I mean, he's getting ready to give Elijah a big old promise, which is great. But it's just, that is what spoke to me. Because many times in the Bible, we, have been told as we pray, we go to our space, it's not an outward thing, it's an inward thing. That would be more in the New Testament, I guess. But still, that was the thing that really stuck out at me, as well as the angels in the first part, because that's always, yoo-hoo, that was my youthful experience like you had in Sunday school. With if an angel came, man, something was getting ready to happen, so.
Yeah.
But I think it is truly the mantle and the whole inward conversation, and then you definitely show that by the different translations under 3.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's internal, it's spiritual.
Thank you. We have time for one more. What else do you think is being made of that? Yeah, Roger, right in the middle.
The last statement there about the sound of sheer silence. I had the opportunity to work in the school business for a bunch of years there. And if there is silence there, you better look around because something's fixing to happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. If you've ever had toddlers at home, that's the most dangerous sound, right? Yeah, yeah. My mother tells a story about my brother who was a toddler. He's about 9 years younger than I am, and she was lying down on a Sunday afternoon for the only time she got for herself all week was Sunday afternoon, and she noticed that it was too quiet. She came out, and he had found a tube of her lipstick and was coloring on her brand new sofa with the lipstick. So yeah, that's. I want to finish by kind of turning to that last question, which is, all right, so what does God say to Elijah in the wilderness that God couldn't have said elsewhere? And I think it's a combination of what drove him into the wilderness, also the fact that God shows up in that gentle breeze, that silence, that still small voice. Elijah has exhausted his understanding of how God will show up in power. He doesn't have any allies, and he has to step away from, or at least he thinks he has no allies, he has to step away from not only the political institutions of the day, Ahab, Jezebel, and their operation, but even to step away from the religious institution. He has found he is no longer able to imagine how God is going to keep him safe, Elijah safe, despite all the times God has shown up. And it's only in the wilderness, and it's only in that quiet voice, the not expression of power, not the fire, not the earthquake, not the wind that splits stones, but in that quiet voice, that internal voice, that intimate voice, that Elijah holds on to that truth. Sometimes we choose to go to the wilderness because we recognize that it's hard to hear that voice when we're surrounded by, sure, it's electronics and digital, but it's also just the noise of society. It's the noise of our neighbors. It's the noise of our families. It's the noise of the city, of the town, of the village. Sometimes we have to step away from that in order to hear what has always been true, in order to find that God that's always been with us. I think it's remarkable that Elijah discovers God not only in that place, but in that voice, that if things weren't quiet, you would miss it. If you were expecting something else, if you're counting on something noisy, a proclamation, the way a king or a pope or a bishop or a priest or a teacher or a principal or a boss would make those proclamations, you'll never hear it. You've got to step away from all of those mechanics to find it. Elijah was running for his life, so I don't think he chose it, but God chose to use this opportunity to sort of reveal how God shows up in wilderness. Next week, our last week in this series, it's the last Sunday after the Epiphany, which is to say the last Sunday before Lent. And we're going to look at the story of Jesus in the wilderness. We'll look at Matthew's version of that story the week before we hear it in church. And we'll look at some New Testament examples of wilderness. And we'll see where God meets Jesus in the wilderness after his baptism. Glad y'all are here, and hope to see y'all next week. Thank y'all so much.